happens to non-white children who go to predominantly white schools and racism isn't talked about at all, because they're going to experience racism, but nobody's going to be talking about it. So they're gonna think it's them. They're gonna think it's them. They just aren't pretty enough. They aren't cool enough. They aren't good enough. And that shit will carry with them for the rest of their lives. Hello, beautiful people, and welcome back to my channel. My name's Kira. Subscribe if you're new, and without further ado, let's get into today's video. So this is actually a pretty impromptu video. I was actually just journaling. I've been doing shadow work all morning, kind of accidentally, meaning I didn't mean to. I just started thinking about things and I was like, I should probably just do shadow work because this stuff wants to come up. And something that was coming up for me was the ways in which I sometimes feel uncomfortable in situations with like hyper feminine women. And it's not that I'm made uncomfortable by them, but I feel myself judging myself when I'm talking to someone who is super feminine. And so I went into that because what you need to do when things like this come up is you need to go into it, right? And so I started to kind of ask myself why that is. What is it? Because I also was trying to name that feeling, because I've never been able to put a finger on it. Like, and it's like, I love these women. Like I want to be there with them. I want to be friends with them. I want to engage with them. But part of me, I can feel myself judging myself in a weird way when I have like someone who's really feminine in front of me. So then I was like, where is that coming from? Because that is not right and that is weird. And I started to think about the ways in which women of color are made to feel ugly and unfeminine and masculine from a very, very young age. And what came up for me was this memory I had of my mom had just bought me this beautiful sundress. It was a pink sundress, and I was like 6. I was 6. And she bought me the sundress. And I remember she showed it to me when I was in my room, and I said, "Oh, Mom, I can't wear that. That dress is for pretty blonde girls." Now, as a 6-year-old, I had already gotten the social information that in this body, in this skin, with this hair, I could not be pretty enough to wear a dress like that. By the age of 6, I knew that. I knew that so much that was an automatic reaction for my mom to come in with a sundress and me to say, that's not for me. That's not for people like me. Which also makes me very, very upset, because this is why critical race theory needs to be taught in schools, because at the age of 6, I was old enough to recognize the power dynamic. Like, okay, obviously at 6, you're not like, racism is a structure that causes blah, 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 blah. At 6, I recognized that prettiness was not for me. And those were the only words I had to describe something that is a system, or a symptom of a much larger system. But I already knew that I was kicked out of the normal group, the pretty group, the attractive group by the age of 6. So if children who are non-white are picking up on signals like that at the age of 6, they deserve, not just them, but their peers, they deserve to have them and their peers learn about the history of racism. Otherwise, that child, that small brown black child, will attribute the experiences they're having that are negative and exclusatory and racist. They will attribute those experiences to themselves. That's what I did. Because when you're 6 and you can tell that you're not pretty enough, but you're not taught about racism, and no one else is taught about racism, especially, now this is out to my biracial girls raised in white families, if if you are a biracial person raised in a white family, or if you are a person of color raised in a white family, you are not having those race conversations that kids of color raised in families with that same culture get. Black kids in black families get the talk. I don't get that talk, right? So when I go to school and I'm treated different and I'm not learning about racism anywhere, that fucks me up then. That makes me insecure. That makes me not have self-esteem. And that's what happens to kids, especially if they're living in white families. But regardless, that is what happens to non-white children who go to predominantly white schools, and racism isn't talked about at all because they're going to experience racism, but nobody's going to be talking about it. So they're gonna think it's them. They're gonna think it's them. They just aren't pretty enough. They aren't cool enough. They aren't good enough. And that shit will carry with them for the rest of their lives. And that is not effing fair. That is not fair. Just because of white fragility and parents are too fragile, they don't want their kids learning about race. Well, if they don't want their kids learning about race and racism and the history of what actually happened, more Black and brown kids will have to suffer the long-term psychological consequences of being a Black kid in a white environment that doesn't speak about racism. That is continuous abuse. So not only should critical race theory be this conversation right now, it needs to be mandatory, because if you are not doing that, these kids growing up in these institutions are going to grow up with so much insecurity based on the experiences they're having with their white peers that are really racially charged, but they don't know that. They're too young to know that, and they're too young to understand that. So they deserve for it to be talked about. And the thing is, even if they are a Black kid who did grow up in a Black family who got the talk, even if they do know, or even if they have been told, they still are going to have those insecurities, and they still are going to, part of it is going to be attributed to themselves, because you don't have the psychological skill set to place a boundary of, I'm not ugly, I'm just a brown kid in a white school, and that's why I'm being treated differently. You don't have that kind of skill set at a young age. You barely have it. You barely ever have it. If you do get it, you're lucky. You know what I mean? But yeah, today when I was, thinking about that situation when I was 6, and I told my mom that dress is for pretty blonde girls, my mom said, when I said that, like, it broke her heart. But it just started this morning, like, more and more instances coming up of all the times that I received the message that I could never be pretty. Do you know what I mean? And that I just was, it just was never like an option for me to be considered like attractive or pretty or desirable. Like, it's just, and the different also, this goes hand in hand with like a lot of other microaggressions, like tone policing, and just all the times that I was told I was too loud and too passionate and I talk too much, too aggressive, whatever it is, like those go hand in hand. And it just really started to make me investigate my childhood, specifically in schools, and just all the different ways that I was made to feel unwanted, and the ways that I was attributing all of those to my own behavior, and like that was all my fault. I always thought that was all my fault. But looking back, it's really not. It's just racism and a bunch of microaggressions coming together to form a certain narrative that makes a young biracial Black girl feel ugly and feel masculine. And so I think that's why sometimes when I'm talking to somebody who is very feminine, I can feel myself start to judge myself. And I can feel myself kind of, I don't feel like I'm being my full and complete self in that moment. I feel that I'm trying to soften myself up. Like, I try and match their energy, and I know that I'm a Pisces, and some of that is very, very natural and innate for me. But it's like the trying to change myself and trying to come off more soft and more feminine that is self-harm to myself. That's not integrity. Do you know what I mean? And that is not, I'm not doing that for the right reasons. When I'm talking about these people, it's not that these people are saying or doing anything that makes me feel that I'm not accepted. I am just immediately not accepting myself in the situation, if that makes sense. Which is interesting because, you know what? I'm honestly unpacking a lot right now, and you're watching some of it happen on screen. What I'm realizing now too, okay. What I'm literally realizing right now is that I think this conversation, what I'm literally saying right now, and the fact that I have never really felt feminine around women a lot of time. Well, not never, but a lot of times around specifically like very feminine presenting, probably thin white women. I don't feel very feminine because I'm compared to them, which it has been the epitome of femininity for however long, you know, the thin white woman. So when I am in a situation with them, I start to judge myself and I feel that I'm not feminine enough, but regardless, I don't feel feminine in those situations, right? And I think what I'm realizing now is that is why I've only ever dated black men, and probably not even, well, okay, white men are a whole different story, obviously, whatever, but I have never even dated white men. And I think part of that is something to do with this masculinization thing, because I feel feminine around black men. And I've also been like, what's interesting to me is that I feel that I appear masculine to white women and feminine to black men. Now I'm trying to assess if that is like completely accurate in that. I bet I wasn't the same person in both scenarios. Do you know what I mean? So it's hard to say how authentic that is, because it's like, am I just trying to amp up the femininity around men, period? That's very possible. Or am I just being made to feel more aggressive by white women? That's also very possible. So it's like I'm kind of in the space of, so who am I then? So who am I really then? And this is part of like what I'm going to be doing a lot of work with, like on this channel, on my podcast, on TikTok, like in my work in general, is kind of encouraging women, and also me doing this myself, of like really digging deep into, so what do we actually want? And who are we actually? Do you know what I mean? When you take away the patriarchal influences, when you take away the male gaze, when you take away the internalized misogyny, what is really under there? So there's those, but then also when you take away the masculinization that you went through from your childhood and the insecurities that came from being a person of color in a PWI. When you take those away, then who are you? But first you have to get those away. But before even that, you have to look at them. And you have to try and understand them. You have to try and understand where they're coming from. So I'm still at that phase. I have by no means like I said, this was this morning. Like I said, this was this morning. So there's going to be a lot there. And it's like, you still have to kind of hold space for both. Hold space for both truths of, yes, I did feel ostracized. Yes, I did feel ugly. Yes, I did feel lonely. Yes, I did feel rejected. And there's a compassion that you want to have towards that, and that it really is healing your inner child, and like looking at those scenarios and looking at the baby that you were that had to take that, and just kind of like really seeing her and having compassion for her and saying, you know, I recognize that happened to you. don't ignore it. Don't ignore it. Don't pretend it didn't happen and you were too good for that, because I think some of it is our ego in a way being like, almost just feeling embarrassed and sad that that happened and that you weren't wanted in whatever way that you were made to feel you weren't wanted when you were really just black, right? But recognizing that that happened and really seeing that and seeing your inner child and being like, yeah, I really see that that happened to you and I'm so sorry. But it's not true. Like, but that's not true for you. The things that they made you feel were true for you are not true for you. And just because people treated you that way doesn't mean you deserve to be treated that way. And just because people told you were ugly and treated you like you were ugly doesn't mean that you are beautiful and they are racist and wrong. And you really do, you have to accept that it happened, but also acknowledge that it shouldn't have happened and that you didn't deserve for that to happen, right? That your inner child didn't deserve that. But you are recognizing that that happened, you are seeing them, you are hearing them, and you can recognize now, later on in life, the different circumstances and power dynamics that allowed that to happen and encouraged that to happen. And but you have to hold space for all of that. And so it's hard. It's hard, it's tricky. And it's not easy because you do feel, it's hard to really go into your trauma and really look at it. And really look at it and say, this is why I am the way I am. This is why I feel the things I feel when certain things happen is really from something that happened when we were so young, that the perspective we formed around that is so innate to us that is actually going to be the hardest thing to recognize, because it's so innate to us. That's what I'm saying. Like, this feeling that I've had that my whole life around like super feminine white women. And it's like that feeling of not being enough around them and the judgment that comes up that kind of makes it difficult for me to always lean in to the friendship is like coming from an insecurity that was formed out of racism. Like it was really formed out of racism, but little me didn't know that. She didn't know that. She deserved to know that. She didn't know that. And she made whatever assumptions she did about the world based on that, because she didn't have all the information. And so the assumption about the world was, it doesn't want me. At the time, and in some ways that was true, but it wasn't true for the reasons I thought. It wasn't true for the reasons I thought. And that, because I thought it was me. I thought it was me. And so I look back at her and oh my God, I just want to give her a hug, right? Because she didn't know. She didn't know why she was being called these names and whatever. Like, she didn't know. So of course that is the perspective she forms. And of course she starts to judge herself under that lens. Because she's 6. I mean, honestly, like, I was getting that information before I was 6 to form that statement at 6. So this, obviously this happens from birth, like, and we can't be placing, again, this is why critical race theory really needs to be taught in schools, because you cannot place that kind of responsibility on a young child to differentiate what treatment she is receiving because of her own behavior and what treatment she's receiving because of systemic racism. So young children deserve to be taught critical race theory in school. Young brown and black children deserve it, because if they don't and they grow up in a PWI, they are going to attribute the racism they experience to their own failure. That's not fair. And we can't have that anymore. I think that's really unacceptable. So yeah, that is today's video. That is today's thoughts. A lot of shadow work coming up today. Like I've cried so many times today, and it's like, Alexa, what time is it?
The time is 10:54 a.m. Have a good morning.
It's 10:54 a.m. I've cried several times. So yeah, thank you so much for watching today's video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Check out my podcast, which will be linked down below. Check out my Patreon, which will also be linked down below. And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.